So on the very simple arithmetic, at a starting price of $23 a tonne, carbon offsets from forestry would be financially attractive. Without a carbon price or without a carbon farming initiative, they're above zero cost. So fair enough, the farmers aren't going to do it yet. That's all right, that's understandable. That's why we produced the cost curve, to try and show what sort of barriers exist to undertaking each of these activities. And then we can solve each barrier, solve each one for the particular barrier. In energy efficiency, the thing we've got to solve is how can you spread that capital cost out? How can you share the upfront burden? With forestry, it's more how can we deal with the annual cost when it costs more than zero to do. It's generally consistent with best practice farming, for example, planting trees along riverways or along fence lines as shelter for livestock, windbreaks or shade stands. It's usually very, very sensible and consistent best farming practice. Doesn't mean it hasn't got a cost though, and we've measured what sort of cost that is, and therefore you can get a sense of what's the burden that government policy needs to try and overcome. And then of course we move into the higher cost areas, and not surprisingly we've had a lifetime of low-cost power in this country, so the cleaner power opportunities do have a higher cost. You can see in volume though, they're almost as much as the forestry or the energy efficiency together. The total volume that we've taken this chart across here to gets us to around 25% below 2000 levels. That's the upper end of what the government's current target ranges is, and it's the lower end of what the scientists say that we need. So because ClimateWorks Australia is affiliated with the climate scientists, we wanted to make sure that we didn't stop at just the 5% target, that we tried to see, could Australia achieve emissions reductions to at least what the scientists say we need? And what we found is the answer is yes. This is before we even look at international credits or any other forms of major social policy change, for example, telling everyone to only own one car or eat less meat. We've ignored all those sorts of policy suggestions and just looked at, let's continue our economy as we would, let's drive the cars as much, have the lights on for as many hours, but let's look at whether technology could be more efficient during those hours. They were the rules for our research. And we went through the economy sector by sector and then ranked it by cost and just added it up. And the volume came to the 25% reduction target, what the scientists say we need. Interesting findings out of this, apart from the sheer volume that it's possible, is that there's no single solution. You can see there the power sector won't do it all, the land sector won't do it all, and energy efficiency won't do it all either. But together, we get there. So the good news I see in that is that's a very empowering message. It means that everyone can play a part in this transition to a low-carbon economy. It means that all of us can be part of saving energy use and therefore lowering our energy bills, doing interesting new land sector practices that are generally very sensible best practice farming, and being part of powering our economy with cleaner, low-emission energy sources. So whether you're a glass half full or a glass half empty type person, you can sort of see, well, there's a lot to do, lots of small bits added up. The flip side is the burden's on no single entity's shoulders or no sector's shoulders. It's for all of us to share. So what I thought I'd do is show these numbers again to drill down on what does it mean inside each of those sectors. Oh, firstly, I forgot this slide. This was all done before we had a carbon price, of course. That was last year. This slide here shows what happens when there is a carbon price. So you'll see where's my little pointer? There we are. This top cost curve chart, that's exactly the one you saw before. Just put smaller there. And then in the middle, we apply a $20 carbon price. Now, this was before we knew it was going to be 23, so we put 20 and then we put 30. Because over the next 10 years, it'll be in that range. And what you'll see is, remember how much was below zero? It was about it was 48 million tonnes out of the 250, so it was about a fifth of the tonnes. Then you see it doubles with a $20 carbon price. So that mathematics of what's the upfront cost, spread it out over the life and net off how much you save from avoiding the carbon and using less electricity, you'll see when you're avoiding a $20 carbon price, you double how much of this activity becomes profitable, it becomes sensible business practice to do it, if you can work out some of those financing structures, which I'll come to. When the price rises to $30, you nearly triple the volume that becomes cost effective. And you'll see there that 135 million tonnes would be cost effective on that simple mathematics. This red line is drawn at the 160 million tonne mark because that is the 5% target. Now, I know I said the scientists say we need more, and we do, but in the current political environment, at least both parties, the opposition and the government, agree on a minimum 5% target. So whoever's in power, that red line is what they're aiming for. And the assumption is that we'll need to buy permits overseas to achieve that at least cost. And in the early days, that may be correct. But what we show here is, as the price rises, it becomes more cost effective to do a lot more of it at home. And that means we're upgrading our equipment, our factories, our farming practices. And that's good for the economy as well as good for the planet. Now, you've heard about the carbon price package today. This is just a quick illustration to show. In our report, on the left-hand side here, we assessed the range of barriers that are preventing those activities from happening. So if we can achieve all of this technological change in Australia to reduce emissions, why aren't we doing it then? So we studied that. Now, the first reason is the cost curve showed it was a cost for all but the first 20% of the activities. So that's the first barrier. And then we looked at energy efficiency and what were the other barriers of why was that not happening. And you'll see that there's a combination. So investor profitability was the barrier for everything except energy efficiency. Capital availability is a big barrier for energy efficiency. That you've got to have access to this upfront funding to buy the new equipment. And if you're a large factory, that can be a very expensive piece of equipment. The package that you've heard described by the government provides billions of dollars in upfront capital grants. $1 billion for the manufacturing industry, another $500 million for land sector management, and $10 billion in the Renewable Energy, Clean Energy Finance Corporation. You've heard all the measures. I'm not going to go into them in too much detail. But what we did was look at the barriers to each of those measures. Information was another one. Energy efficiency sounds common sense, but when you're running a small business or even a large one, you're flat out trying to grow your market share, respond to customers, do the thing you're good at. You're not necessarily well informed about what technology has done in the last 5 years in some of these areas. And it's quite expensive in terms of time and transaction costs to inform yourself. So the government has recognised that as well. We measured all of these barriers to those activities. And there's now a range of funding programs for SMEs, for industry organisations, land care to teach farmers more about this. So the government's also recognising that the price alone won't trigger all of this activity, that we've got to address some of those other barriers. And then lastly, there are some harder barriers, what we would call structural barriers. So for example, the split incentive. When you live in a property but you don't own it, then even if you could have access to the upfront capital, you're not going to want to spend it because it's not your property to invest in. They're called split incentives and structural barriers, and they're a different range of measures. Again, in the package, the government has responded to some of those, for example, with the development of a national white certificate scheme, the energy saving initiative, that would be a national way where energy retailers would have the obligation to upgrade the energy efficiency of not just households but commercial and industrial buildings as well. So quite a broad response there from the government on one particular structural barrier. And then there are a range of others around lack of project scale, so fragmented opportunity. And this is where I was really pleased to hear Arthur mention things like the green street idea. It is very sensible to try and aggregate the smaller scale energy efficiency opportunities, because that all of those tonnes, that 48 million tonnes of savings that you saw on the curve from energy efficiency, it's the sum of a number of very small buildings as well as some larger ones. So aggregating and coordinating that is really sensible to help bring down the transaction costs, and then that overcomes another barrier, which is separate from the actual price of the activity. And of course, there's skills and training money in the package, and that helps overcome a lot of these barriers too. ClimateWorks is going to put out a more detailed report in about a month when we've really gone through each of these barriers and tried to match it up to the items on the cost curve to see, is it going to be unblocked? Can we really now think that we could probably achieve the nation's targets?